We can stand on objective markers now. This is the greatest thing ever to happen in the history of the planet.
What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and let's talk about the new Warhammer 40k meta watch that just dropped on Warhammer Community. This is a big one, especially for people who play competitive play or who even play sort of competitive aligned games of Warhammer 40k, because we get a lot of rules changes for tournament play in this one. And that is because we are seeing the release of a document called the Leviathan Tournament Companion. This is basically the replacement to the Grand Tournament packets that we saw released for previous seasons of competitive play. In this document, the design team has given us some looks on how they intend Leviathan tournaments to be run. Now, importantly, this is basically just a guideline for running tournaments. It is not a hard and fast set of rules or requirements to play Warhammer 40k in any format or run games of Warhammer 40,000. But the Games Workshop events team considers it the official way to play Warhammer 40,000 tournaments, although they do leave up room for adaptation. Right now, that doesn't really mean anything. It basically means that if you are going to a Warhammer sanctioned tournament, this is the system that they're going to be using. So they have a format for you to expect. But if you're playing in a different format like WTC or in an independent event, then they may use some slightly different rules. However, I do think this is good because I do think it gives some expectations for players who are going to events they haven't necessarily been to yet, that they can expect a format that's similar to this. And in addition, it also gives the design team the ability to rapidly update the balance of mission cards, because as we see in this document, they do have printable mission cards inside this PDF. You can replace some of the cards from the official deck with. Some of these cards, especially Deploy Servos skulls, have found to have been wildly unbalanced, and so this, I think, helps you use those mission mechanics in your competitive games without basically just having cards that you'll discard whenever you draw them. So we do see a couple of changes to deploy servo skulls, teleport homers, and behind enemy lines, and I appreciate that they do have a changed text box here. You can see that in the red text. That is the stuff that they've added for this packet specifically, and those are the rules that they expect to be used in tournament games of 40k. Now, before we dive wholesale into that document, we do have a Meta Watch video as well, where they interviewed both Mike Brandt from the events team and Stu Black, the studio head, and they discussed some upcoming changes for Warhammer 40k. The biggest one is that a balance update for both points and mechanics. The first one of the edition is expected next week. So we had rumors that it would happen last week. Those didn't materialize. And this week, obviously, it was basically radio silence. But next week is when we can expect to see changes. And specifically, they have called out some changes as well. Indirect fire, Eldari, and in the video, they also discuss units with the towering keywords such as Knights and Wraith Knights will all be getting a look at. And these are the biggest concerns that the community have right now.
So yeah, there are a couple of targeted changes that are going to come in the next week that will help kind of take the edges off some of those. As Mike says, Fate Dice, Eldari, and kind of towering and indirect through the points changes. So new points document coming soon that will kind of set out the start of that edition proper.
Super exciting, and that's directly from the horse's mouth. No more rumors anymore. We know concretely that that's happening. So let's dive into the Tournament Companion document and talk about all of the rules changes. Now, in the mission sequence, they do have some changes for individual steps. The Determine Mission step now has some predetermined mission, special rule, and deployment layouts alongside terrain layouts that they recommend you play together. So basically, these are the intended mission selections that are the most balanced. And the thing I like about this is that we do have this alphabetical sort of designation for all of these. So instead of writing all of this out, all you can do is, if you're a tournament organizer, you can say, hey, everybody, we're playing combination F today. We're playing F3. So we're on Supply Drop, Shelling Rain, Search and Destroy on table layout 3. And suddenly everyone at an event can reference this document and knows exactly what terrain and mission they're going to be playing. You don't have to explain it to them. It's all laid out in this document. And I think that's actually super cool. In the future, I'll probably do some deep dives on each of these combinations and talk about the special rules that each of them bring. But if you're playing some practice games, I would rock some practice games with one of these combinations. Now, the other huge change is going to be in step 4 here for objective markers. In Leviathan tournament missions, models can end any type of move on top of an objective marker. I had theorized that I didn't think the objective movement restriction rule would stick around, especially because they didn't play it on stream when they were showcasing these Leviathan tournament missions on the Warhammer Twitch stream, and it is a brutally problematic rule. Objective markers blocking movement, as they are instructed to do inside the core rules, makes it so that large base models are incredibly easy to movement block. A lot of the factions and unit types that are actually not very competitive anyway were being hit pretty hard. So things like melee monsters, a combination of 2 unit archetypes that are not very good in 40k traditionally, you were easily able to make it impossible for them to engage you. And it was just toxic as heck. So I'm glad that that has been removed in tournament games. I expect basically every tournament to adopt this. Last but certainly not least, we talked about the terrain layouts they have, and in step 5, create the battlefield, they also discuss using those layouts. Now we have some changes to the mission cards. Deploy servo skulls is the big one. This is the objective where when you control an objective, you can move it 6 inches towards your opponent's deployment zone, which is generally what you're going to do. And you score VP at the end of your turn, depending on where that servo skull is. Now, reportedly, this mission is already kind of problematic because the player going first has the first opportunity to move the servo skulls. So they can actually move them towards their opponent's lines, and then their opponent will only have the ability to move them back to the center, where the player going first can then move them back in order to score them. So the player going first basically has the first opportunity to score, and the player going second doesn't get anything to compensate for that. So this mission is a little problematic to begin with. It does require the first player to extend themselves pretty extremely, so I don't know if that is actually going to be the case once people learn how to play the mission so much. A problem that arose was that once one player pushed one servo skull too far, and because each servo skull moved at the end of every turn, not just at the end of their own turn after they scored it. You can have a situation where you controlled a servo skull, moved it forward towards your opponent's deployment zone. If they couldn't then come contest it, you can move it again towards their deployment zone at the end of their turn, and then back on your turn, you move it again towards their deployment zone. And if once you got that 3-turn movement, you probably scored the maximum amount from that servo skull. And on printing, these all stacked, so you could score 15 victory points per turn from a single objective. That's been changed so that they are no longer cumulative. So if you get the servo skull into the deployment zone, you only score 8 victory points. That means that the mode is not quite as swingy, which I appreciate, but I do think it is still a little problematic. Now, we also saw some changes to secondary missions. Deploy Teleport Homer used to score 2 VP if you completed the action within 6 inches of the center of the battlefield. Now it scores you 3, regardless of whether or not you're using tactical or fixed objectives. You get 5 if you're using tactical objectives and complete the objective within your opponent's deployment zone. This actually makes it kind of easy to score if you have a lot of utility units, if you're playing fixed missions, and it does seem like these changes are here to make fixed missions a little bit stronger. Just being able to score essentially a minimum of 15 victory points if you're able to complete this 5 times within 6 inches of the center of the battlefield every turn is really good. It does require you to have a lot of units that you're okay with sort of throwing into the meat grinder, but I think a lot of factions do, and Tyranid specifically get benefited by these immensely because you can currently score victory points with Spore Mines. So you can put Spore Mines in the middle of the table, continuously deploy Teleport Homers with them, and score a minimum of 3 victory points a turn. 4 victory points a turn if your opponent allows you to deploy them in their own deployment zone. So that actually seems like kind of a no-brainer, but there's a lot of other factions that have, a lot of super cheap utility units, and they're going to be able to farm this pretty highly. Especially now with the new action rules, where it's possible to advance and perform these actions, or even perform them with non-infantry units, unlike a lot of these missions in the previous edition. So things like dedicated transports, lone operative characters, all those can complete these actions, so that's actually super useful for them. Behind enemy lines also got a little bit of a bump. You get 4 VP if you have 2 units in your opponent's deployment zone, 3 VP if you have 1 instead. Previously, it was 2 and then 4, and this just makes it a little bit smoother. So again, I think trying to incentivize those fixed secondaries, because the fixed secondary system is a little bit weaker than tactical secondaries, I think, as people have been sort of realizing, unless you have a very, very highly tuned army for it. And there are going to be some armies that make use of these extremely well, but it's not every army, and I do think you have to build to play those fixed secondaries, which is definitely the intention of the mechanic. Now, we talked about the mission and layout pools, so let's move on and talk about the terrain layouts themselves. Now, these are just examples of terrain. They're the recommended terrain to play in tournaments. They aren't required, but I think people will be expecting something similar that looks like the terrain that is shown on these layouts. I think a little bit of a problem here is that they don't provide fixed measurements for these terrain systems. I mean, it's kind of hand wavy. It's mostly because terrain sometimes comes in different shapes and sizes, and also gets bumped around during an event. And I don't think the organizers want people to sort of fuss over the minutia of it. I think I would say a little bit of a downside of these terrain layouts is that they are entirely composed of essentially ruin area terrain. There are no other terrain types on the map. I think that's a little bit unfortunate. That said, the terrain rules in 10th edition 40k are very samey. Ruins basically function like other terrain features. They just also have the line of sight blocking effect that, especially for competitive play, makes it, lines of fire more interesting to draw. So I understand why they would only use ruins, but it is sad to lose some of the flavor of like splashing forests and, inspiring statuary and stuff like that in there. But anyway, we'll dive into the layouts themselves. As we can see, they are mostly composed of rectangles. As the key told us, these lines here, these line terrain elements, are meant to be between 2 and 4 inches, so they're kind of line of sight blocking a little bit. They'll impede a little bit of movement, but largely I think these are intended to be moved over slightly with large flyers as well. You may be able to hop that one if it's only a few inches tall, using the new fly through the air mechanics. One thing I'm a little bit worried about with these layouts, but maybe rectified with the upcoming balance change, is that towering keyword. Basically, the only things that are going to block line of sight to monsters and vehicles is going to be these large square areas. We're seeing these shorter areas are meant to be kind of short, between maybe 3 inches or so, which means a lot of monsters and vehicles and stuff like that is going to be seen pretty clearly through them. And the towering models ignoring the base of the terrain for line of sight means that they're going to have pretty clean line of sight basically across the entirety of the battlefield into your deployment zone. And there's very little you can do to stop that. That said, we may see changes to that. So I think that with that in mind, these layouts look great. I did play a ton of games on, especially this layout, terrain layout one, on stream. You can go check those out over on my stream replay channel. And I actually really enjoyed the layout. The interesting lines of fire that got cut not only through the center with a lot of these lines being blocked. You have to be able to basically move into the middle to be able to fire down these alleyways. But then also this play around the sides here with these two big L-shaped ruins is really interesting and cool. I was actually very impressed by these layouts, at least for non-towering armies. And we see that kind of continued on. There's a theme, especially of these L-shaped ruins in the deployment zone to make the deployment zones very defensive, but then give, units a staging area where they can move around if they need to get to other areas of the battlefield and force the opponent to try to outmaneuver them to actually get lines of sight. Overall, very happy with these layouts, and they actually look much more interesting than the previous 9th edition US Open layouts, which were just big bricks of terrain, big old squares, and got very boring and very samey, made every game basically play almost identically, and moving from them to a more updated format was a real breath of fresh air. Now, we also have pairing and ranking metrics as well, and this was actually a big criticism that got leveled at the previous Grand Tournament packets. They didn't tell you how to run a Grand Tournament. They just told you how to play in relatively balanced missions, but that was about it. Now, these rules are relatively simplistic, and again, these are a set of guidelines that the events team is encouraging events to use, but it's not sort of a requirement. In pairing players, this is what determines who your opponent is each round. Looks like they are recommending that you pair first by wins losses, so you play somebody with the same number of wins as you. Secondly, by how difficult those wins were, so you will tend to be paired with players of a higher skill level as you go undefeated through. So basically, you're going to be playing people who lost at the same time as you over the course of the event to make just the level of competition as tight as possible for all of your games. And then within those two criteria, you're just paired randomly. So while that category determines who you play against, the overall rankings determines where you actually place at the end of the event. And they recommend that you do that first by wins. So not using any other systems like a win differential. Second, by how difficult their opponents were. So essentially, the later you lose in a tournament, you will have played against players who are more skilled and you'll be ranked higher. And then last but certainly not least, by victory points. So how many points you score each game, up to that maximum of 100. Lastly, they just have some discussion about making Warhammer tournaments fun, and the purpose of a Warhammer tournament, which is generally speaking to play a bunch of Warhammer, not necessarily to crush your opponents and make them feel bad, but in fact just to have fun games, which is what generally people are there to do. And so with that is all of the information contained within this MetaWatch article. Honestly, I'm super excited. It did sort of feel like the company left us high and dry a little bit after the release was dropped last week, or last weekend, I should say. But now we do have this information for use at events coming up this weekend, so starting tomorrow and moving on to the future, which actually heartens me a little bit. Things were looking a little dire when the release dropped. We did get all the indexes last week, and it was super fun and interesting, but very quickly the cracks started to show, and I do think that if we get a prompt update this coming week, 10th edition is going to be looking better and better. So I'm psyched. I think that this tournament packet is great. This is exactly what we were asking for out of the GT packet in 9th edition and never really got. They just gave us a mission set and then told us to use it however we will, but with very little guidance on terrain, no guidance on pairings or placings. And while most events I don't think is going to use every single part of that document, I think establishing a baseline for players to expect when they go to a Warhammer 40k tournament at a new store or travel out of country for one is super duper important. And one of the biggest downsides of the competitive community right now is that it is so fractured, but having some guidance from the designers themselves that tell you what people should expect at the very least at a tournament is huge. Super psyched about this article. Let me know down in the comments what you think about it. Big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video, and thanks everybody who supports the channel either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members and Twitch subscribers. I love you all. Everybody keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.